Hello, everyone. We're back on Low Key Confused to start to dive into some of the events that we've been seeing in Minneapolis. One of the questions that we're hearing a lot from viewers is what is standard use of force guidelines? What is training? What is proper training? What is the training different bodies get? And how do we start to make sense of this? And so, to start answering these questions, we are honored to be joined by Dr. Phil Kopp, who is the chair of Politics, Administration, and Justice, and Darren Lee, who's a lecturer in criminal justice. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having us.
Pleasure.
So, let's start broadly. Are there standardized use of force guidelines at the federal, state, local level, or are they different in different agencies?
Well, I think the first thing that we wanted to put out there is that when you're talking about use of force, it is never going to look good. It's never going to look pretty. It is a violent act. And the minute that that starts to look good, we have bigger problems as a society, whether it's justified or unjustified. But to start off addressing your first question, the real only universal standard in terms of use of force for any type of law enforcement or policing would be Graham versus Connor, which is a Supreme Court case that governs the reasonableness of force. When you get to the different levels, you're going to have a whole variety of different policies and procedures, even continuums about what force can be used when.
Yeah, I would say that if we look at the levels, different levels of government, I think that at the federal level, there's no actual formal standardized policy on use of force. What we tend to rely on federally are Supreme Court rulings, pieces of case law that kind of set the guide rails for us. But at a state level, at a local level, for instance, at a state level, we are really our training is governed by California Post, Commission on Peace Officer Standards and Training. So they set the guidelines, they set the policy directives for uses of force, techniques, all while considering case law and the legality and statutory law. And then as we move down to the local level, we start to utilize different department policies that get really down to the granular level. And when I say that, getting down so deep into the weeds, we're going to be talking about the type of baton that an officer uses or the type of handcuffs. But in terms of the standard, we tend to rely on a variety of different pieces of case law at the federal level and some at the state level.
This case law that is helping make decisions, like, is there a unifying philosophy? Like, what is justified use of force?
That's going to be set by Graham versus Connor. And it basically says that the force has to be viewed as reasonable in the eyes of an officer in the same circumstances without like the benefit of hindsight. And if you look at that standard, and I think we both agree, it's really tilted towards law enforcement because it's not what a public would think in terms of the justification is what an officer would think based off of their experience and training. But I mean, the basic standard for force to be reasonable is that it has to be under what we'd call IDLE, in defense of life or a serious bodily injury that could lead towards death. That's the justification for not just officers, but for a citizen to use force, to use deadly force.
And I think when we look at Graham versus Connor, and also I need to mention that Graham versus Connor is the main piece of case law that police officers rely upon. But there's a lot of iterations of Graham versus Connor with subsequent cases that have come about and that were judged by the Supreme Court. When we look at the official term is objective reasonableness. What is a reasonable amount of force that an officer can use legally? And so, as Dr. Kopp was saying, the objective reasonable standard is based upon the perspective of a reasonable officer placed in a similar circumstance, having to make split-second decisions, understanding that that officer doesn't have the luxury of 20/20 hindsight, only what he or she knows at the time of the incident. And so the Supreme Court was very liberal in terms of allowing police officers the latitude to make some of those decisions in what I call kind of a spectrum of reasonableness. It may not be the perfect use of force as we look at it 4 weeks later on a YouTube video. It just has to be reasonable in the eyes of a police officer. And let me say one more thing about that.
Yeah.
And you might wonder, well, gee, why is it just from the viewpoint of a police officer? Shouldn't it be from the viewpoint of an average citizen of what reasonableness is? But I have to say, doing the job for 30 years, that I have developed a certain perception of what a threat is based upon the years of prior training and experience. Where if you were to put a layperson in my shoes, he or she would very likely not see the same threat level as I would. And so, do I do I support what the Supreme Court said in that area? Yeah, I do. And I want to add to that when you're looking to decide whether a level of medical care is appropriate, you wouldn't ask a layperson whether this brain surgery was appropriate and how to do the brain surgery.
Mm-hmm. Let's, for our viewers, actually, do you mind? Let's set up your experience, right? Let's introduce you to the audience. You mentioned you have 30 years of experience.
Yes.
Introduce yourself.
Yeah. So I started my career in 1994 as a young police officer. Went through the academy, and I spent about 7 years at a police department in the San Gabriel Valley. In 2000, I moved over to the Anaheim Police Department, where I finished out my career. I can tell you is that when I entered law enforcement in the 90s, policing was very different than it is today. And so, as a part-time lecturer here at Cal State Fullerton, I don't look at that as a bad thing. I look at that as a different way of look at policing and bringing that into the classroom. So I spent 30 years as a police officer. I've worked a variety of different assignments, including detectives, emergency management, community policing. And one of the things I really enjoyed doing was I was a use of force instructor.
Oh.
And a use of force instructor gets formal training on how to incorporate case law and policy, and then teaching those techniques, physical techniques, to the police officers, so they stay within the guide rails of the Constitution and policy and law. So that's my experience in a nutshell.
Thank you. And what perspective are you coming from, Dr. Kopp?
So I come from a more academic perspective. I hold 2 masters and a doctorate in criminal justice, and I teach courses on policing here at Cal State Fullerton. I also have some practical experience. I was never a police officer, but I spent 11 years doing private event security. So I was involved in many use of force confrontations in terms of diffusing different types of things. So I've done some of the similar aspects of a police officer without having anywhere near the training or the authority, but I come from a more academic perspective.
Thank you. I would imagine the training is really robust to be able to set somebody up that in a high pressure situation, they're going to be able to know how to react. I mean, that sounds like a monumental feat. What does training look like at, it seems like you're most familiar with the local level, so you can speak to that, or if you know about other levels.
Sure. What I can say is, in the realm of training police officers, the training will not eliminate risk. It will not eliminate injury. It will not eliminate death. Sometimes those things happen. And what I can say is that if we, as a policing profession, train police officers well, we reduce the risk of those things happening. It is a very challenging thing to teach officers to potentially take a life. But the training that is involved really starts at the academy level. The academy training for police officers in California is about 644 hours, something like 6 months of training.
Wow.
And within that curriculum, we have arrest and control tactics, ACT training. They receive that basic training in the academy, and then when they get out of the academy in 5 or 6 months, they go into the field with and engage in what's called field training with a field training officer. And typically, in most jurisdictions, that's about a 3 or 4 month process where the young officer, with the coaching of his field training officer, get to apply what they've learned in books and the academy to real life scenarios. And so there are basic minimum standards that most police departments have for individuals to get at. I'm sorry, to get out of that field training process. But then when they're on their own, they're expected every couple of years to fulfill what we call post-perishable skills training. Now, perishable skills include vehicle pursuit driving, tactical communication, and arrest and control, ACT. And so every couple of years, they have to perform, engage in retraining, recertification, and that's part of that ongoing continuing education for police officers. And that's the very basic minimum. Departmentally, individual police departments may have additional training on top of that.
Yeah. And then I also want to add, kind of building off of what you said about the high stress, the academy doesn't just teach them these skills. We'll call it a controlled immersion. You learn the skills, but then part of it is actually placing officers or potential officers into increasingly more high stressful situations to learn decision making. And so really the only difference between the public and the citizen in some of these encounters, I mean, the public and the police, is that the officers have been placed in these situations so that they acknowledge, hey, I understand my heart's beating 5,000 beats a minute. I'm stressed out. I'm okay. Here's how I calm myself down. Here's how I keep making decisions. That's not to say they don't feel all of those things, because while the training is extensive, it doesn't eliminate those. The only people that could be in those types of situations and be completely okay are probably like military special forces who are training nonstop for these situations.
Yeah. So this is what we see as a high standard of training. There has been some concern expressed in the news and social media about whether the rapid expansion of federal immigration officers has allowed for this type of training.
Yeah. You want to comment on it first?
I mean, I'll talk broadly, and
yeah.
I can.
Yeah.
From what we had to do a little bit of research on this, because a lot of our work looks at county and municipal. But from what we found, federal law enforcement or the federal agents are not similarly trained to local officers. And I think we both agree that a good deal of what they're being asked to do, they were not trained for.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I think when we look at the current events that we've witnessed on the news, what we're really looking at are what's called EROs, Enforcement and Removal Operations Officers, that are responsible for identifying, locating, and taking into custody folks that are undocumented. And then we have another type of officer called Homeland Security Investigations Officer, which they work for the same employer, but the training that they receive trains them to engage in higher level investigations, similar to a local detective in a police department. What I've seen on television is potentially ERO officers in the field engaging in traffic stops, quelling disturbances, participating in civil unrest and riot control. Those individuals that went to Glencoe, Georgia, at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center don't necessarily get the same training as a local California police officer, yet they are placed in situations where they are essentially performing the duties of a local law enforcement officer. So let me expand upon that. When police officers here in California go to the academy, they're not just learning about the Constitution and search and seizure. They're also learning about domestic violence, traffic enforcement, how to quell disturbances, drug enforcement, DUI investigations, child abuse investigation, a myriad of topics that a local police officers will encounter on a daily basis. I don't necessarily think and a enforcement and removal officer is getting that training.
Mm-hmm.
And let me also add to that. I don't know the exact number of hours, but I can tell you just from the media, the federal government has touted 47 days of training for some of these immigration officers. 47 days of training equates to probably 3 months of training.
Yeah.
Local police officers get 6 months of training. And so you're getting this federal officer with 47 days of training, and you're placing that person with a gun and a badge into our communities to engage in all of the social ills that a local police officer is encountering.
And I think there's also the other part that the academy is teaching them, like tactical awareness for officer safety. Like officers are trained like to recognize this is a bad situation that I should not put myself into. Because like if we think about a traffic stop, most everyone who's going to see this has been pulled over. Every move an officer makes from the minute they turn on their light to get out of their car has been practiced and rehearsed for officer safety. And if you have individuals who were never trained to do traffic stops doing this, you're going to have a host of problems. Every one of the situations that Professor Lee outlined, those are all specialized enforcement scenarios that have classes specialized to train you, not just the tactical how to do it, but the constitutional aspects of what you're doing, because every one of them has repercussions. And I would just draw your attention to this week where you had a whistleblower come out regarding Homeland Security, and that these officers weren't being taught basic things like the constitutionality of what they're doing. That's a massive problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But let me add to that. I am not against immigration enforcement. I have concerns of how we are enforcing immigration law. And even to get more specific, when we're looking at putting agents into the field to handle volatile situations, 47 days of training and then going into the field, I don't think is an adequate amount of time to, and you mentioned it's called stress inoculation. You put this officer into these situations over and over again, and you force him to navigate the situation. Over time, you're able to handle them more efficiently and more safely. But boy, if you're going to try to hire umpteen number of federal agents in a short amount of time, there's going to be some shortcomings to that training.
Yeah.
Well, and then we could also look at agency decision making, because anytime we've had any type of civil unrest, I know the public will get really frustrated when they'll actually see the police back away and get out of an area because they're like, hey, we're outnumbered. It's just going to be bad. You're not seeing that same discretionary decision making on the part of the Homeland Security.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a good point. It was fairly probably in the last 10 years where local police officers have changed philosophies. Back in the day, 10 years ago, if a crowd didn't disperse or a violent offender didn't submit, police officers would continue to push. It's kind of a new way of thinking. Is sometimes it's okay to back away and de-escalate the situation and go back later and try to handle it. And I don't think the federal government is quite their philosophy is quite aligned, not so much aligned with local law enforcement here in California.
Mm. Can we dig more into the changes that we've seen, Professor Lee? You said in the last 30 years you'd see changes in police training, in approaches. I'm sure you've been tracking these changes as well. What are some of the major changes that we've seen in policing?
Well, I look at philosophy. Traditional policing was very much enforcement oriented in the 80s and 90s, and some of that, right, wrong, or indifferent, has come from some of the media that we consumed at the time. But the way we look at policing now is less of this warrior mentality and more of a guardian mentality. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the major paradigm shift. Is we don't always have to be warriors 100% of the time. And I don't think the public wants a warrior to show up at their house all the time when they're, for instance, if you were a victim of a rape or sexual assault, you don't necessarily need that warrior to show up to your house. You need a caretaker and a guardian. So being able to kind of like move back and forth between those two roles is something that we had never seen in 1995. Today, we're seeing more of that.
And I mean, to build off what Professor was saying, like the metaphor is like the military has enemies, the police have a public. But then you're also going to have the increase in the educational standards for police. For instance, California is moving towards all police officers having to have, at a minimum, an associate's, if not a bachelor's degree. But you also see the influx of technology. The big one has been body-worn cameras. But with all of that introduction, you also, in this, since the 90s, you have an increasing turnover in officers, because you had an entire generation that came online in the 70s and early 80s who are now retiring, and you have a new generation of officers who have very different experiences than do the existing ones who are, they're coming in and they're wanting to see policing change because they're going, hey, this isn't what we're seeing, is not okay. But I mean, the big part is a lot of the technology, and also different, not just like body-worn cameras, but different weapon systems. Because if you imagine in the 80s, you didn't have tasers, you didn't have a lot of the less lethal options. There's a lot more options available if you have to use force.
The other thing that I'd like to mention is that 30 years ago, when I first started in the career, this idea of officer wellness, mental wellness, was not even a discussion topic. And I'm a firm believer that if our officers are mentally well, that when they go out into the field to engage with the public, they treat people a little bit differently. If you have an officer that is not addressing some of the traumas that he or she has experienced in their career or personal lives, and you throw that person out in the street, we're essentially rolling the dice. Hopefully that next encounter does not trigger that officer to, at the lowest level, treat somebody with disrespect, but at an even more serious level, using force when force is not needed. So I think in the last few years, what we've seen, and is also backed up through current legislation, is more of a focus on officer wellness, first responder wellness. And the idea that if we can better ensure our first responders are grounded and well and happy underneath the roof at the police department, that the positive byproduct is that they treat the community better.
Can we dig into the technological changes a little bit more? Body-worn cameras, how has that changed policing?
From a research standpoint, the two concrete things that we know when body-worn cameras are present in a department, you have fewer complaints against officers. You also have a reduced incidence of use of force. Now, the mechanism behind that is not really clear, whether it's what we're calling officer-induced passivity, i.e. the officers know they're being filmed and they're not being as aggressive, or if the public is realizing, holy crap, there's video of this and they're not acting badly. But those are the two things we see, all in addition to like increased evidence. But while the body-worn cameras for the police have an impact, the cell phone cameras may have had a larger one because now everyone has them. It's almost like a body-worn camera, except the public has it. And those can be both problematic and they can be beneficial. Like if we focus on the most recent incident in Minneapolis, the number of camera views that you had of that incident made it really clear the facts of that, or at least what appeared to be the facts of that use of force encounter. Were those not there, all we have is what people tell us. The video is a lot more powerful. But that technology is also, I think, what drove a lot of these changes, because if you think about when we had a lot of the civil unrest about police activity, a lot of it was driven by video of these incidents that caused the public to really say, no, what you're doing is not okay. You're going to respect our rights and you're going to treat us differently.
I look at the body-worn camera as a positive attribute. And you would think as a police officer, I wouldn't want people to see what I was doing in the dark shadows in a dark alley in the middle of the night. However, I think the body-worn cameras have turned out to be very beneficial in two areas, uses of force and officer injury. When we introduced the body-worn camera to the Anaheim Police Department in 2015, I was working as the training sergeant. So my role was to help and develop new policies and new training tactics of how are we going to really efficiently deploy this new piece of equipment. What I noticed when we rolled out the body worn cameras, and this was fairly evident in the first couple of months, uses of force plummeted. Our statistics changed dramatically. And I would attribute that drop to some of what Dr. Kopp was talking about. But when we reduced those levels, those uses of force, what we actually did as well is reduce the potential for injury. Every time a police officer uses force, we risk the possibility of someone getting injured, the officer or the offender, or someone dying, the officer or the offender. Anytime we can reduce uses of force, we're going to reduce the risk of injury and death to members of the public, which includes the police officer. And I think anytime we can reduce the number of force usage on camera and in the public, what we end up doing is creating a different narrative of what police officers do and how police officers do that. And I think to Dr. Kopp's, as Dr. Kopp said, is there's this proliferation of people on their cell phone cameras. Well, when we give police officers essentially their cell phone cameras, what we also do is we leave the narrative not just to the member of the public to attach whatever narrative or words are associated with that video. We also allow police departments to release video and give it context. Why did this happen? What happened before the video was turned on? And I'll finish with this, in case you don't know, a new law that came out a few years ago requires that if a California police department has an officer engage in a significant use of force, which includes in custody deaths and deaths at the hands of police officers, like officer-involved shootings, the municipality is required to release that footage within 45 days.
Wow. Does anyone make the argument that the proliferation of footage, the body-worn cameras, has been detrimental to the field? Or is it an unalloyed good?
No, I like it. As a member of the public, I like it. Because when we look at policing, part of good policing is accountability and transparency. Okay, because we are in a democratic policing society where we are accountable to the people. And so on one hand, I appreciate the Instagram or YouTube video for the entertainment value, but really we have to suspend judgment when we look at these videos and understand the context. And sometimes with these uses of force, there is a formal investigation that occurs, and we need to suspend judgment until the investigation is done. The other thing I want to say about that is I appreciate our local law enforcement agencies starting up Instagram accounts and Facebook accounts where they can reach the public with their own iterations of the same video. When we put context behind these videos and just don't leave it up to the YouTuber to blast it out there for clicks, when we put context behind it, then I think we're using the video responsibly, accurately, and to the benefit of the greater good of our communities.
And I would add that I think the downside is that the vast majority of the public don't really know what they're looking at. They're just going off of like their gut feeling of what they saw. I guess to give an example, like in our Police and Society class, when we talk about use of force, it's one of the last things we talk about in a 16-week semester, because the student has needed all of that material before that front loaded to get them to the place where they can look at that use of force encounter and actually like kind of take a step back and apply the law and say, okay, this looks horrible, but what actually happened? And I think the positive side of the police having the footage is that they can release the entire video, because oftentimes the public didn't catch it, or they conveniently edited out what might have instigated that use of force.
I like to use the term, um, it may look awful, but it still may be lawful. Most uses, uses of force look bad on camera. And so I think it's imperative that our criminal justice instructors um, really focus on this. We've talked about Graham versus Connor and the case law and the legal parameters behind uses of force, so we can really deconstruct uses of force to have a very, I call it a discriminating perspective on the interaction. We really can't look at it at face value.
What courses do we offer in our criminal justice program for any of our viewers who do want to be positioned to better understand these issues?
So let's see. At a minimum, we're talking about our Police and Society course, Criminal Justice 315. They could also look at Criminal Justice 484, our substantive criminal law. We have a course on search, seizure, and interrogation, which does not teach you the practical aspects. It's actually all about the case law behind the Fourth and the Fifth Amendment. We have two parts of that. We have courses on civil liberties, constitutional law. We have another course on courtroom evidence. And that's in terms of like the constitutional aspects of use of force, or policing in general, or what your rights are.
Professor Lee, which courses do you teach?
Well, I started out in 2005 here at Cal State Fullerton as a lecturer in the sociology department. And I retired from law enforcement in 2024, and then had to, because of the retirement rules, I had to kind of give it up that position. But I'm very grateful that Dr. Kopp hired me as a criminal justice professor. So I teach courses. I teach policing. I teach criminal justice 385, was a race and inequality in the criminal justice system. And I think I teach one more. I teach about 3 classes here.
Law, punishment, and society.
Thank you.
3 or 465.
465.
Yeah.
Right.
For students who aspire to go into policing, what is the benefit of getting a BA in criminal justice?
That's a good one.
Well, the first one is what we find. It's exposure to different ideas and different cultures, critical thinking skills. You're going to have a much deeper breadth of knowledge. So, for instance, our substantive criminal law class is 16 weeks, focusing only on that aspect. They will teach you that in the academy in about a week. What I've heard from students who have come to Cal State Fullerton, gotten their degrees, and then gone into policing, what they'll tell them is that having their bachelor's better prepared them for the academic aspects of the academy.
It's funny, you mentioned having a well-rounded view of the world. And I can tell you a quick story. I was working as the training sergeant. I was working in an administrative role for about 6 years. Hadn't been in the field for a while. But as one of the byproducts of working inside, I got to review a lot of different pieces of case law, reports, continued to engage my students as a lecturer. And I started to look at my role as a police officer a little bit different because of the academic influence. The traditional way of handling defiance in the field was give an order. The person may yell back and be defiant, and maybe I would shout the order. And if the person still didn't listen, I would go over and physically make the person comply.
Ask, tell, make.
Ask, tell, make. That was the traditional philosophy. And I can remember being out in the field for probably only a week. And I remember we received a call of a mentally ill person. I think he was a substance abuser, showed up at the counseling center and punched one of the counselors in the face and was walking away. And the radio call came out, and I responded as the field sergeant, and I was waiting for the other officers to get there. Well, I got there first, and the victim and the witness waved me down and said, "That's him right there across the street." So I pulled my car up as I'm waiting for my backup officers to get there, and I shout at the person, "Come here." and he yells back at me an expletive I can't repeat for the audience. And the old me, the traditional police officer, would have yelled louder one more time, and he would have yelled it back at me. And then ultimately, I would have walked across the street and probably would have used force, legal force within policy. I probably would have done that. But the new officer, the new mindset that I had, I stayed on my side of the sidewalk, and he yelled back at me, goes, "You know what? I ain't going over there. Why don't you come over here?" And I thought to myself, okay, I'm going to comply with your instructions. So I walked across the street, and then I engaged him in dialogue. And ultimately, the conversation led to not a use of force, but to me, to the point where I was able to direct him to sit on the pavement, sit on the ground, upset, violent as he was, and wait for backup to get there, where we resolved this scenario peacefully. And what was funny about that is I had never gotten a Yelp review before. But these people that were watching me actually wrote a Yelp review with my name in it. And it was the first time in my career that I was ever publicly recognized for something good that I did.
Yeah.
And then put in as a user review.
I mean, there is an interesting, I keep coming back in my mind to how we started in terms of whose vantage point is going to judge policing, right? Like, is it, as you said in the Supreme Court case, it's from the eyes of the officer that we are going to judge right action. And you made the good point that there's a reason for that. The officer is the one who's trained to look at a wide data set and determine the right path forward. And yet, with technology, and with the story you just told, we do see the importance, or maybe the beneficial importance of shifting our vantage point and allowing more perspectives in, right? Like the Yelp review, that was the community's response to your policing. So it's interesting to think about it in that dimension.
Well, and I think it's important to note that kind of the justification, and it's not just actual threat, it's perceived. And so, like, one of the things like I would teach in classes, like with students, I'm like, okay, first off, put yourself in the shoes of the officer in that situation. Would you be in fear for your life? That perception right there would justify use of force, and depending on the type of what you're encountering, possibly deadly force.
Right.
Because it's perceived. Like, a lot of times you see the videos where someone who is ultimately unarmed is shot, but you have to look at what they're doing as fearful. Like, if they're reaching like behind their back, we all know, if we watch television enough, that's what people seem to do if they're trying to pull a weapon. Well, if you're a police officer, you can't wait until the hand is out here because it's too late. If you have that fear, you're going to react, because like a common saying in policing is that it's better to be tried by 12 than carried by 6.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Because ultimately that is the stakes on a lot of their decisions.
Yeah.
One of the things that my students bring up with me all the time are questions as to why did that officer have to shoot that person that didn't have a firearm? And so when you look at the science, when you look at some of the very limited scientific research that we have, it takes about a quarter of a second for an aggressive assailant to pull a gun out of his waistband and pull the trigger, about a quarter of a second. It takes about 3/4 of a second for a police officer to recognize a threat and then unholster his gun and then point the handgun at the offender and then pull the trigger. So you're always going to be behind the curve. And so sometimes police officers may preemptively take their firearm out and may even preemptively fire that weapon, killing the person. And then you later find out all that person was reaching for was a wallet, or all he had in his hand was a handful of sand, which in and of itself are not deadly weapons. But remember, when we look at Graham versus Connor, the Supreme Court didn't say it had to be the perfect use of force. It just has to be objectively reasonable within that spectrum of reasonableness. One other thing I want to add to that is I think it's our responsibility as educators, as YouTube vloggers, as media personnel. I think it's really important that we don't give a twist to some of these videos for for thumbs up or user likes or page clicks. I think what's really important is to understand the context and educate the public in this area. I think what we're doing here is very valuable in our classrooms and here in this video. And I really wished we could replicate this to a larger audience.
Mhm. Are local law enforcement agencies collaborating with immigration officers?
So, under state law, broadly, uh, California police officers are not permitted to do strictly immigration enforcement. However, there are situations that Professor Lee can outline where police will take part in those activities or similar analogous activities.
So you're right with the legislation. Local California police officers do not have the authority to enforce federal law. And so by statute, that is not a component of our local law enforcement function. I can say though that if an ICE agent, an enforcement and removal officer, if there are a group of them doing an enforcement activity within the city jurisdiction, um, our local police officers will not routinely assist them with the capture of who they're looking for. However, let me say this: is if they have a judicial warrant, a federal warrant for an armed and dangerous person who happens to be undocumented, and they're going out looking for that person, from an officer safety, public safety standpoint, the local police departments may assist. And I say assist, not taking over, assist from the standpoint of officer safety. I can also say this, that when you watch maybe a news clip of some ICE agents chasing people around at a local car wash, you probably don't see a local police officer engaging in that chase. Now, I need to say this is if in the enforcement of their immigration law, the ICE agent engages in a use of force and somebody is going to potentially get hurt or die, um, you might see a local law enforcement officers assisting to prevent injury and death. We still have a public safety um, responsibility, irrespective of who those people are. We enforce the law and we ensure public safety for anybody, regardless of their immigration status.
Some of the chatter on social media around use of force, when somebody does die, is why did the officers shoot to kill? Why not just shoot to injure?
That's a really great question, and it comes up a lot. And I can tell you, in my 30 years of doing law enforcement, I've never seen a policy, a police department policy, that gives an officer the authority to shoot to kill. Officers may use deadly force to stop a deadly threat or a threat that most may likely result in serious bodily injury. So let's kind of deconstruct that for a
Yeah.
second. An officer may use deadly force to stop a threat. And what is that threat? Obviously, a deadly threat. Somebody with a knife, somebody with a gun, somebody with a baseball bat about to hit somebody over the head. That's a great example of a deadly threat. Um, but you may also, as an officer, use deadly force to stop serious bodily injury. So, what is serious bodily injury? In a nutshell, any injury that can result in the victim going to the hospital, being admitted to the hospital. So, let's say someone swings um, swings a pocket knife and maybe potentially could cut somebody's ear off. Maybe somebody has a rock in their hand and they could smash somebody's head in, or maybe it's a car that could potentially drive over somebody and break a leg and send that person to the hospital. So, in those circumstances, and remember, the Supreme Court recognizes that many of the incidents police officers engage in are rapidly evolving and they don't have the luxury of 2020 hindsight. So, they have to make split second decisions. And so, as a police officer, having done the job for 3 decades, I can tell you that um, I don't want to shoot. I don't want to kill people. I didn't sign up for the job to go out and kill people. I signed up for the job to help people, and part of that is the potential for using deadly force to stop a threat or to stop a threat that's not only being posed to the officer but any member of the public or maybe other officers. Let me add to this is that sometimes officers that join the police academy think they can deal with killing somebody or taking a life. I can tell you, I know personally more than one officer that was forced to take a life. And that officer, his or her mental wellness went downhill.
Mhm.
Some of these officers couldn't do the job anymore. Some of them couldn't do the job because they took their own lives. And I can say that I want the public to understand that, at least from this local perspective, this local retired police officer, none of my friends and cohort decided to get into the job to kill people. They wanted to get into the job to help people. And sometimes that involves death and injury, but
Mhm.
they were willing to sign up for that job.
I'm still though trying, maybe you can answer that. I'm still trying to understand, even if you're being faced with a deadly threat, when does one make the decision to like aim at the heart and just aim at the kneecap, right? Like,
Well,
so
so that's actually a point we hear a lot in class. Why
Mhm.
don't they shoot the gun out of their hand, shoot them in the knee?
yeah.
And the easy, simple answer is they're not that good. If you think about it, you know, a bullet is probably about the size of your fingertip,
Mhm.
and you're having to project that out to hit something.
Mhm.
Under the best of circumstances, most people can't hit something easily this big, let
Mm.
alone in a stressful circumstance. And the thing to remember is that every bullet that leaves a firearm can travel for over a mile. And every bullet that leaves an officer's weapon, they're responsible for where it goes. And so if you're shooting to stop a threat, you're going to shoot where you have the most likelihood of actually hitting your target, which is unfortunately right in your center
Mm.
torso, right
Mhm.
where your heart, your lungs, a whole lot of damage can be done. So it's not that they shoot to kill, it's that they're literally shooting for where they are most likely to have a hit.
Interesting.
The only time that, and I won't say it's the only time that I have heard of officers being actually instructed to shoot where death is imminent would have been the North Hollywood bank robbery, when they were confronted with two suspects who, after taking multiple amounts of rounds from officers, it was discovered that they were fully body armored and that the only place that they could shoot to stop the threat was the head.
Oh, okay.
You know, if I am faced with a situation where somebody is trying to kill me, I want to rely on a tool that has the highest probability of stopping the threat, not killing, but stopping the person from wanting to kill me. And I've been in that situation before. We have a bunch of tools on our tool belt. We have batons, taser, pepper spray, our handgun, our hands. These are all tools that we can use on somebody trying to kill us. But remember, split seconds matter. And so if I told you, and I don't have the exact data on taser, but I'm thinking it's in the 60%, 50 to 60% range of effectiveness. Pepper spray, lower level of effectiveness. And so people say, well, you know what? Why didn't you use your pepper spray before you shot and killed them? Well, pepper spray, my taser has a lower probability of stopping the threat. And in a situation like that, where split seconds matter, I, as a police officer, cannot afford and cross my fingers and hope that these tools work. I want to choose the most effective tool to stop the threat. And it's going to probably be the handgun, as I direct or point that handgun in the upper torso like we're trained to do.
What might we see in your classroom as you're trying to teach students how to understand the officer's perspective?
So
Yeah.
what might be helpful for a citizen is in like when I was teaching the course, I would do it, and I believe Darren does it. We actually would actually use the force encounters with the most evidence, and we'll literally deconstruct them and
Mm.
ask the students to apply the law after they've learned about like all of the case law and all of the practical aspects, like excited delirium and like the physiological response to like what happens. Because like some people might ask like, well, why do officers use a lot of force when taking people into custody? And I believe the statistic is about 80% of the individuals who are taken into custody by police have three commonalities. They're either drunk, high, or mentally ill.
Mm.
The uniform thing about all of those is if you have any of those or an interaction, you have reduced pain sensation.
Mm.
If you think about anyone who's gone out drinking, they might, hey, what happened to me? I don't remember how to get this bruise. If you look at the tools that an officer has, the overwhelming majority of them are based upon pain compliance. I cause you pain, you comply.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're drunk, high, mentally ill, you're not
You're
feeling
not going to
pain.
register it. Yeah.
And it's going to result in more higher levels of force used to overcome something.
Mm-hmm.
And so like what I found is like a lot of times like when we start to deconstruct these incidents, students just go, I don't like it, but under the law it's justified.
Mm-hmm.
Because they start to look for little things that they might not have seen before.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll go over the legal parameters of the use of force, and then the second part of it is I will place students in the classroom. They're seated in their chairs. I will place them in the shoes of a police officer and give them a scenario, and then ask them to make decisions. And what I say is, I'm going to be your offender, your criminal offender with potentially the means to kill you. And it is a radio call of shots fired in this neighborhood, and you're going to encounter me, and you're going to have to make a decision. If when you think it's time to use deadly force, your handgun on me, I want you to raise your hand and keep your hand up.
Mm.
And so what I found is at the beginning of the scenarios, nobody raises their hand. They wait for me to take the gun out, my clicker, my PowerPoint clicker, and I click, 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 click.
Mm-hmm.
You all got shot. And they're like, I don't believe how quickly that happened. And over time, over the next scenario, and the third scenario, and the fourth scenario, pretty soon they start to understand, number one, the legal parameters, but number two, some of the human dynamics behind it.
Mm-hmm.
And by the third, fourth iteration, they're more quick to take their gun out, their fingers, or their hand, and raise their hand. And then the last scenario is I will put them in that situation, high stress situation, maybe turn the lights down a little bit because it's now nighttime. And then I pull my wallet out
Mm.
and think of how many people shoot me. And they go, oh my gosh, I'm going to be in so much trouble. I'm going to go to prison. Like, you might go to prison, but was what you did objectively reasonable? It may not have been perfect, but was it objectively reasonable with the current information that you had at that moment? And I love it when the students go, yeah, it was reasonable based
Mm.
upon what we know now. And that's something that I wish we could replicate more and more for the community.
Mm-hmm.
Maricopa County did something. This was a number of years ago. They actually invited their largest critic, who actively would protest them all the time, to come and do use of force scenario training. And they filmed it, and this was a news clip that I would show in class. And it was the perception change from that individual from when they started to afterwards was dramatic. I also remember a number of years ago, the University Police Department would bring out their FATS trainer or their firearm simulation trainer, and students could actually kind of go through it. I don't know if they'd done it in a while, but we would try to get some of our classes to go through it so you could actually put them in that immersive scenario, because that's when you finally go, I didn't understand until now what it's like to be in those shoes, mm-hmm. and to like thinking, okay, this person could actually harm me, because it's that that feeling of fear, it's very, very hard to replicate.
Mm-hmm.
You know, Professor Mo Miller, who's here in our department, she went through the FATS simulator, and I remember she's like, "Wow, that was a challenge," because what you're dealing with, you've got all this academic knowledge, and then you have to apply this academic knowledge on a human scenario with all of the different human dynamics, the body movement, and it doesn't come out the way the book said it was going to come out. Mm-hmm. Which lends itself to another comment: is sometimes police officers may shoot somebody in the head or the back, and the public says, "Oh my gosh, they executed this poor person," And what people fail to understand in a physical altercation, the human body is a miraculous machine that turns and twists in different areas. And then you incorporate the perception, the perception and the lag time involved with an officer seeing a threat and then telling the brain telling his hand to reach down and pull his gun out and then fire the gun and then stop firing the gun. All of these things happen in rapid succession, but there's actually a process that the mind and the body goes through. And sometimes they're not aligned with a perfect use of force where, the person has a knife and you shoot the person and the bullet goes through his heart and stops the person from killing you. Sometimes the person is pulling a gun out or pulling a knife out and then is running away as they're firing the gun, which may result in someone getting shot in the back.
Oh, and I mean, we've consistently seen the support of like the 15-foot rule, which is basically someone can actually pull out a knife or anything and close 15 feet and stab you before you can recognize the threat and respond. So I mean, 15 feet is not that's a distance. So I mean, and the officers are taught this. Like if they're 15 feet away and that comes out, you can't. You have to respond.
Yeah.
Closer.
I mean, yeah. I mean, everything you're painting out just shows how amazing it is that we have been able to do training regimens that reduce the level of deadly force, right? Because as you're saying, like when you do these simulations, people sitting in the classroom, they see how easy it is to default to use quick force. So the months of training so that an officer doesn't just react and takes in all the data and tries to prevent harm is so critical.
Well, and I think one really important statistic is that the media always shows us the worst of the worst. So we might think that police use of force is rampant and out of control. Less than 1% of police citizen encounters result in use of force.
And is that decline, with all the things that we've talked about, the reforms, is that even declining more?
It probably has, but I mean, if you think about less than 1%, this is over decades. You're getting infinitely smaller, but just the vast number of police citizen encounters do not involve any type of force. But that's not what the public realizes.
Right. I wish the public knew the whole scope of what a police officer does in his day, and the use of force it occurs in a very small percentage of the encounters. The other thing I was thinking about is when we're talking about like officers' response to a deadly threat, a lot of folks don't understand the time it takes for a police officer to get his gun out of his holster. The nomenclature of a holster, a lot of people don't understand the nomenclature of a holster. There's also all these safety mechanisms, retention straps, and you have to camp the gun a certain way to get it out of the holster. You have to pull down, we call it a hood, the top retention strap, you pull it down and then you twist it, and then you have to pull the gun out at a certain angle. That
let me explain why.
Takes a while.
So in a lot of holsters, if my hand was the holster, there's actually a hook that's built in so that when the gun is in there, if you don't pull it out at the right angle, the hook will catch the trigger so that it cannot be pulled out of the holster to prevent anyone else but the officer from withdrawing that firearm.
Okay.
Right. Yeah, but people don't understand that part. So getting back to what we're kind of talking about, I wish the education of the public could be wider in breadth.
Yeah.
Deeper, in more depth.
Clearly, there might be times when an officer makes a poor judgment call and is considered possibly in that standard of reasonableness to have not met that criteria. What is the body that determines if that standard has not been met, and what is the protocol with the officer?
Well, let me address that. So every jurisdiction has a different procedure that they follow. Unfortunately, there's no standardized procedure that is recognized throughout the state, throughout the country. But I can tell you from the perspective of where I came from, which is here in Orange County, there are 3 entities that will investigate an officer-involved shooting. And that relates to an administrative investigation, um, a criminal investigation. And so what will happen? So hypothetically, if we had a shooting today, at the end of this, the person that got shot would either be still there or go to the hospital. And then body worn cameras would be a source of evidence. So the body worn cameras are going to be treated like gold because it has a lot of information. When it comes to the investigation, there's a criminal side, and I'm saying the potential criminality of the offender. Maybe that offender pulled a gun or a knife out on the officer. So there's a criminal side. Our homicide detail, our homicide detectives will investigate the criminal side as it relates to the offender. And then there's potential criminality on the part of the officer. So the Orange County District Attorney's Office will come out and send a team out to investigate the potential criminal culpability on the part of the officer. Okay. And then internally within the police department, we have a major incident response team that will go out and look at the incident, not from the standpoint of discipline or telling an officer he made the wrong decision, but from a training standpoint to reduce the chances of potentially maybe there was a mistake or maybe there was something that could be done better that we could implement tomorrow or next week to avoid something like this happening. So major incident response team, MERT, will look at it from that standpoint. So the officer will typically get sequestered. We don't want the officers and the witnessing officers to collaborate on stories. So typically we will separate them. And then there they will wait until the district attorney's office comes and interviews them in collaboration with their attorneys. Because remember, there's potential criminal culpability. So they get the same rights as any normal layperson would be when it comes to being investigated and being interrogated. They still get legal representation. And so all that is done. And what we typically see is the officer that, or we consider the shooting officer, would be put on routine administrative leave. And then we do some evaluations as to whether it's suitable to put that person back into the police office, the police car. Sometimes police officers maybe are not suited to go back to work. So the rule is we send them to a psychologist to determine their suitability to come back to work. And if the officer is mentally not well enough to do that, then we'll take them off and we'll handle it that way as part of the recovery process. But by and large, officers tend to come back to work in good shape. And then we have to think about the long-term effects of that. But for that particular moment, they do well with the psychologist and then they come back to work. Okay. So maybe many weeks, a couple months later, the district attorney's office comes out with their findings and they say, and by and large, using the Graham versus Connor standard and some other case law, by and large, officers come out without any criminal charges being filed. Now, can an officer be exonerated of any criminal culpability but still have violated department policy? Yes.
It's still awful, but awful.
Yes. Sometimes their actions are not commensurate or aligned with the training they received or are outside the scope of what is expected of them as an employee with this police department. So they may be subject to administrative discipline, which could be maybe a temporary suspension or maybe a termination from the job. Okay, so there's a variety of different checks and balances that we have in place.
Or retraining.
Or remediation, retraining. That's a good one.
Thank you so much, Professor Lee, Professor Kopp, for being here to tell us about what threat incidents look like from the perspective of an officer and what training officers get to help mitigate the stress and help them with the decision making in those moments.
Thank you. It's
My
a pleasure.
pleasure.